Good afternoon. I'm Dave Griffith, and I'm the Executive Director and Head Coach of Episcopal Community Services. And good afternoon and welcome to this final and activating panel discussion titled, Where Do We Go From Here? What are the next steps for collective action that can provide racial equity in the midst of the crisis? And looking forward to the economic recovery. May it come sooner than we think. Let's reflect upon what we've learned this week, what inspired us most, and plan for how each of us can take our actions. What is our accountability moment? How are each of us going to be part of the solution? I have been so inspired by all of the sessions of the forum. Our speakers have given us much food for thought. I have two themes that have particularly resonated with me. First, Dean Jackson, Kiva White, and our partners at Scattergood brought up the power of and. We must actively and collectively invest in on-the-ground transformational programs that meet our neighbors where they are to help them escape poverty permanently, and identify the policies that have created and continue to create barriers to upward economic mobility, while also contributing to the inequitable allocation of resources. And we must collectively invest in making intentional structural changes, such as those recommended by Karen Scholkoff of the LEAP Fund, to create more equitable and effective policies that will actually lower the poverty rate. Second, as Omar Woodward of the Greenlight Fund Philadelphia and Jamil Harris Morrison of Achievability brought up, we must face the uncomfortable truth that systematic racism is at the root cause of the generations of toxic stress and trauma, leading to the reactive and violent eruptions in our center cities. This week, we have experienced the manifestation of that agony of our racist history and the failures of our behavioral health system. Now, more than ever, is the time to act. I look forward to discussing the next steps with Sikahema, Sidney Hargro from the Philanthropy Network, Greater Philadelphia, and Joe Pyle of the Scattergood Foundation. Thank you again for attending, and thank you again for serving as the ECS Forum's featured moderator. Can you kick us off?
Dave, thank you very much. Appreciate your comments, and it has been an amazing week of workshops and seminars and forums like this one. We kicked it off at the beginning of the week on Monday with a phenomenal blue ribbon panel, in my opinion. And don't let the others know, but I think this one might be better. It's gotten better. It's gotten better every day, and what a great way to wrap up what has been a phenomenal week. Congratulations, David, to you and your staff at ECS for putting together just a fantastic week of programs. And I think it's like Jesus feeding the 5,000 on the hill. I mean, I think those who have tuned in have been well nourished and well fed by all the programs and what you have shared. So without any further ado, let me introduce our panel today. First, Sidney Hargro is a philanthropy strategist, advisor, and executive leader. He serves as the president of Philanthropy Network, Greater Philadelphia. Sidney, we welcome you, and we appreciate you're lending us some time today. Next up is Joe Pyle. Joe is president of the Thomas Scattergood Behavioral Health Foundation. And at Joe's insistence, he said, "That's all I want you to say," right there. So you can look up more of their bios, and everyone here is has a phenomenal track record, and they've done just amazing things with their lives and really in blessing the lives of others. And of course, David Griffith, the executive director of Episcopal Community Services. David has been with ECS for 7 years, since 2013. So without any further ado, let me try to get everybody up on. There we go. Before we jumped into this really crucial and critical conversation, please know that you can submit your questions throughout the session, and we will try to address them along the way. Abigail is standing by, and will try to get them to me, and I'll try to read it and try to pose the questions to our panel, and we'll discuss it. And by the way, I'm the moderator, but as moderators go, if I've got something to say, I'm not going to be a wallflower. I'm going to jump in.
Sounds
and I'll say
good.
it. So, all right. So,
Yeah, why start now, By?
right. Let me start with Dave. Dave, how do organizations, how do they pivot? And in this, unique time in our history that we'll probably look back on, my sense is that in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we'll look back on 2020 as the way the previous generation looked at, December 7th, 1941, or November 22nd, 1963, September 11th, 2001. There are certain dates in our history where we sort of mark time, do we not? And previous generations have done that, and that has happened in our lifetime. So, in your opinion, David, how do organizations pivot, given where we've been and what's happened, to be able to help individuals?
Well, you're absolutely right on. I think it's March 15th, 2020, when we shut down. I think is how I think when we all had to think about, this is real and it's going to be with us for a while. One of the takeaways I clearly get is that the issues we deal with in terms of poverty and in terms of race didn't suddenly pop up in 2020. But what COVID did was rip the Band-Aid off and expose really the inequities in the system. And clearly events over the summer have really brought racial inequity into the focus in a way that maybe 1968 did, but boy, you'd have to go deep to find a similar moment. I think a couple of things that we as leaders of nonprofits and frankly leaders of for-profits need to think about is first and foremost is collaboration. We heard that theme on the last panel. We are clearly stronger working together. I also will tell you that focus on what is the long-term things we can do, not just simply the immediate needs, which are incredibly important to maintain people and make sure they can get through the immediate crisis. But I think about ECS's values. We have 4: community, dignity, justice, and perhaps the most important is impact. And the reason impact is in there is whatever we do, and I'm suggesting that we do it collaboratively, we use innovation, we use all the things we've talked about this week, but we really need to measure and be very, very certain that what we do moves the needle on poverty, moves the needle on racial inequity, and that we really hold ourselves accountable for the impacts that we can deliver. I think I heard a quote, I'm not sure where this week, but we tend to look at this definition of poverty as an economic issue. It's really important that we think about economic poverty, but it's also important that we think about human poverty. And that balance is something that I think the nonprofit sector, if it's doing its job right, delivering impact and collaborating and working together, I think that's our call to action in this moment in time.
We'll ask each of you, to give a call to action statement, at the end of our hour. Let me pivot here and ask Sidney. Sidney, you've worked in community foundations in New Jersey and in Ohio. In your opinion and in your observation, what are the similarities here with this in this situation, and maybe some of the differences?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the communities that I've worked in, both in southern New Jersey and in Columbus, Ohio, prior to Philadelphia, they're very different. However, they're just as the geographies are different than makeup of the populations and percentages, demographics are different. But I think one of the things when you really look at similarities of the challenges, they are in fact very similar when you start to look at issues related to racial equity and justice, social justice, poverty. You start to, it takes you only a moment to realize that if you dig a little deeper, you'll see a history of policies and systems that hinder the development of access for families, which is very similar to what Omar talked about on Monday. It's actually the same thing like that. I can say that I see that in each community. The other thing that's that I see as similar is really the need to focus on obtaining new ideas that define progress and improvement in communities differently. I think it's too often now when someone says, hey, this is a changing or turning community, or this is an improving community, and what in many cases the unstated piece is that this is a gentrifying community. So the question is like, how do you get at the ideas that define progress and improvement for the communities where people live that is without gentrification, that's with asset building, again, with the ability to stay and be a part of the change in those communities. And I see that, again, each of those communities have pockets of condo developments in communities that were working class and or poor 10, 20, 30 years ago. And those people, the families that were living there are now moving out, right? So that's happening, that's similar in each of the cases. And then a final one is, I think it's really important to really look at how racially diverse the creative communities are in each of those. I count that in Philadelphia as well. And really the need to dig more into that and benefit from the value of having such diverse creative communities within Philadelphia and within the other communities, that it needs more investment and not less.
Sidney, thank you. Joe, I want to turn to you and given some of the things that Sidney mentioned, racial equity, poverty, gentrification, and granted, we may not be able to fully see or realize what will happen. It may be hard to do that given, there's an election coming up this year. It may be the most important election, arguably of our lifetime, right? There's a litany, a list of things that could change the way things go. But in your opinion, Joe, how do you see and where do you see Philadelphia being in 5-10 years from now? And what are some of the factors that may drive some of the things that may change in Philadelphia for better or for worse?
Thanks for that question, Vi. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't put the answer to the question into the context of the killing of Walter Wallace Jr. this week here in Philadelphia. And I think for me that his death, really highlights the structural changes that need to take place here in the city of Philadelphia and across this country. I think that we often this week have talked about Omar's conversation about how do we build assets in equity. And I think that the death of Walter Wallace highlighted our lack of asset building across all aspects of what we do in this city, that we have not made the deep investments in the kind of systemic change that will get to, the racial structural changes that need to happen. And I would hope, to answer that question, Vi, I think if we cannot in this moment radically think about how we use our behavioral health system and our police force and our healthcare system to better serve individuals like Walter Wallace, I think 10 years from now, it will be bleak here in this city. That, we can no longer say that we can't do that. We have to say, how can we find a way to do it? And I think it will require, and I have felt this, before March 15th, but this growing sense of how do I, view my privilege? How do I, as a leader in an organization, create and support systemic change to end structural racism in this country? I want to be really optimistic that Philadelphia can be a better place, but up until the pandemic, the numbers weren't trending in a way that would give you hope. So maybe the pandemic is this, and George Floyd and the racial issues that this country faces, maybe it's the call to action, to wake us up. And I think, it gets back to just take another moment. I think that, when we talk about, I mentioned behavioral health system and policing, but, we need deep educational reform. We need workforce reform, healthcare access. And I think that, we have to talk about it at a true level of change, not a Band-Aid. And I think, and I'll probably, later on when we have the call to action, I'll talk about some of the changes that I want to make in myself and in the foundation that, hopefully will bring about a deeper change. I've not worked as hard as I need to. So I can be both an optimist and a pessimist, Vi. But I think we have a moment in front of us that, it's right here, from the protest on the Parkway to now the death of Walter Wallace, requires government, businesses, foundation leaders, nonprofit providers to behave truly differently. And it's going to be uncomfortable. I know I'm uncomfortable a lot of days. So.
I want to ask you guys, I want to direct this to David, and I'll tell you why. My question will become obvious, I think, as to why David is in the position to answer it. But Joe and Sidney, you guys can jump in. I would love to hear your insight on this. If you'd like to share, how it may or may not have impacted either of you. But I'll start the question by just saying this. My wife and I started a foundation 2 years ago, and so we've had we're doing a virtual event this year, as everybody is. Frankly, I was a little bit surprised at how much money we're able to raise, and so we put together some scholarships and some things. I believe firmly in providing educational opportunities. I always feel, because of my own experience, that it was education that took me out of my Section 8 housing and lifted me out of poverty. But I had a unique gift. I was able to play football and got me to college, or I would not have been able to do that. So my point is this: in my experience, I have not done this as you guys have. All right. Joe has done this, Sidney has done this, and you've done it for a long time. You've done it much better than I have. But this is just my 2-year I have just a 2-year window that I've done this. And so I've helped some kids help pay for their education. One kid just graduated from Bloomsburg University in August. And, you know, we took care of his tuition and books and whatnot. But this is my experience. So this is why I think Dave, I want Dave to sort of chime in on this. It has been my experience that the kids that we've helped who have some level of faith, have had some faith experience, some touch points in his or her life with faith, have done much better in school. Now, because I'm a man of faith, I can recognize that has played a role in how they've been able to sustain themselves and maybe given them hope or helped in some way, shape, or form. So obviously, we're here today under the auspices of the Episcopal Community Services. It's a faith-based organization. So my question here is, what role does the church and what role has faith? What role does it play in helping lift people out of poverty and in their circumstances? And by the way, I get it. As time goes, you know, there are fewer people of faith, and I don't know if that has a role or has. You know, I'm not a sociologist, so I don't know this stuff. I'm just making observations. So, Dave, you may jump in, but it looks like Sidney has something. He's ready to say something. So, but go ahead. Each of you chime in as you wish.
Great question is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Thanks, Sidney. I appreciate a deep and profound question. And look, almost every tradition has a version of the baptismal covenant. And it says very clearly, will you respect the dignity of every human being? Will you treat your neighbor as yourselves? There's multiple versions of that. And what I've always taken that from is it is a profound and deeply spiritual call to service. And as you know, I retired in 13, and I thought I was done, and you know, I got called to this work, and it was a no-brainer to accept. But what
you dropped your nets and you went to serve.
Yeah. Well, let's not quite that profound, but I will also tell you. But what I've seen is, as we work with clients, it may not be spirituality as I would define it, but what I see is an incredible resilience on the people who are experiencing poverty, and the young men and women and the older adults that we work with. And where my eyes were opened is that there's a lot of urban myths around poverty. And let me tell you, nobody is lazy in poverty. You need to be nimble, you need to be resilient. You know, addiction and behavioral health issues, I'll grant you, is a different card. But I think the call to service that says we need to do something more for our neighbor, we need to call for change that may not be comfortable. What gives me great confidence is I know that if we do the work right, people will be better off that otherwise may not have had that opportunity. And in my definition with the covenant, that's the ultimate respect for justice and dignity. I think faith plays an incredibly powerful point in that it gives people, sometimes that's all they have when we meet them for the first time. But I think it's there. But I also think it's a tool that can be used the wrong way. And we need to be really mindful that a lot of things have been called out, as you said, particularly in this election of all time. Respect and dignity, you know, and the call to service is incredibly woven into it. Let's not corrupt that, as to be very blunt, that we've seen some folks do. But resiliency is how I see it make itself manifest. And in my experience, that faith tradition, there's only a couple of Episcopalians that work at ECS, but we're supported by a whole diocese and denomination. But we run into folks, most of the folks we serve obviously are not Episcopalians. And we also have a number of faith traditions that support us because of the work that we do. As you know, the Church of Latter-day Saints also supports us, along with the Diocese of Philadelphia, Episcopal Diocese of Philadelphia, for which we're very grateful. I think you just got to be able to look through what is that common call to service. And then we respond to that. And I think that's what kind of gets me up and motivates me to do what I do at the age I am. I can't imagine doing anything else right now.
I'm glad that that Catholic Charities, participates and lends a hand, David, as does the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In fact, the reason why we met is through one of our church members, Amanda Hall, who worked at ECS. Sidney, you jump in, and then Joe, you follow.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Vi, for taking us for a moment out of our heads and kind of connecting it to our hearts and kind of the soul conversation, which I think is often missing in these conversations. And I hope I can try to, as you stated, that I started to see a connection between your question, Dave's answer, and even what Joe talked about earlier. The first part thing I'll say is, and Joe has heard me say this before, I really think we have to have a wider view of what it means to be in the social impact sector. When we think social impact sector, we think nonprofits and we think funders, and it's very much a process and it's, intellectual piece. But the reality is that the social impact sector and true collaboration and collective action has to also involve faith communities, regardless of religion, because they're a part of that piece of social impact, albeit operating in a different silo, if you will, and that silo has to be brought down and connected. The other piece, I think, that is something else you don't often hear on philanthropic and nonprofit Zoom sessions is the true role of and focus of our work and the work of healing. And this idea that these systems that we've talked about that have been historical and for 400 years have created trauma in the lives of people. Trauma via the notion of systems of betrayal, right? Straight out just betraying segments of our population, Black and brown people. Well, part of that is that even though we're able to survive and many of us find a space of even thriving, the brokenness that is created through those systems of betrayal need to be healed, right? And there's something about this, when Joe talks about the mental health in our systems or just health, when we talk about health and wellness in general, so much of it has to, when you have conversations about like, how do you also carry out that program and be mindful of the fact that we're all in need of, moments of healing from our lives. And I think that, and then the final thing I'll say, which is why I actually started chuckling when you asked the question, is when I was in graduate school, I actually for 9 months spent time personally studying the role of faith and in children in poverty in the Mississippi Delta. And what was really fascinating to me was many of those children did not know they were poor. They were, and their families knew, and their parents knew. But it was something about, to Dave's point, the resilience and the belief and hope that whatever they were seeing at that moment was going to change. It's the same thing you see throughout movements throughout history, civil rights movement, et cetera. Like there is a role to play, is my point.
Powerful. Joe?
Yeah. So I also lead a faith-based organization, and that the Scattergood Foundation is a Quaker organization. And, Quakers talk about that of God in every man and inner light that we all hold. And I think that, building on Dave's comments, or your comments, Vi, and Dave's and Sidney's, that, I think what it's meeting people where they are, it's acceptance. I think it's building trust. And I think that when, I think about, how philanthropy behaves, if that's, my role on this panel, is that, philanthropy may not make those deep investments. It may not build trust in its grantees. Is it there for a year? Is it there for 3 years? I think these are questions that it's coming up. I mean, there's a whole movement of trust-based philanthropy, and where will that take us? So I think that Sidney mentioned trauma and toxic stress, and there's a term that's used in the trauma movement about it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And I think being accepting of what happened to people and not judging them. And I think that faith leads us to that. That we have faith that we can behave differently with the communities that we serve, and that we should. So I would concur with what everyone is commented on faith.
I appreciate that so much, Joe and Sidney. Dave, your words, give me, and I hope those who are watching and listening give us hope, and that we can see maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, given what's happened, especially this week here in our city. And I, something that Sidney said led me to reflect on a conversation that I just had a couple of weeks ago. Does the name Mike Singletary mean anything to you guys?
Yeah.
I know it's been a few years. Okay.
Yeah.
Mike Singletary's and his wife Kim are dear friends, and we were at an event recently, and he told this fascinating story. He was a member of arguably the greatest defense in the history of the National Football League, the 1985 Bears, right?
Yep.
And he talked about how when he was 12 years old, his father left the family, and he's the youngest of 10 children. And the oldest brother, Grady, came home to help the mother to financially to work and to help support the mother since the father left, right? Within 6 months after Grady got home, he gets hit by a drunk driver and he dies. And the mother sits 12-year-old Michael Singletary down and says, "Son, I need you to be the man of the house." And he says, "I'm confused because I've got 4 older brothers who are in the house. Why not them?" And she says to him, "Because there's something special about you. And you're a leader. And I need you to be the man of the house." So here's what happens. A week later, school starts. And as he's walking to school, it occurs to him that he realizes that they just started a busing system in his hometown of Houston, Texas. A bus pulls up in front of him, and 2 white kids get off the bus. As they get off the bus, it's an all-black school. Kids start throwing stuff at these 2 kids, and they appear to be a brother and sister. The little girl's 13 and the younger brother's 12. And they look scared. And Mike says to me, I've seen this on TV, except it was just the other way around. But I remembered my mother's words to me that I'm going to be great. So he says, at that moment, something whispered in my ear, here's an opportunity for you to fulfill your mother's prophecy and be great. So he walks up and he stands in front of the school. Brand new, it's a new school, and he's there for the first time. He's 13 years old. He raises his hands and he says, the next person who hits these kids, you come to me. You come through me. And he says, at that moment, I assumed the greatness that my mother had said of me. And he says, I started to assume that I would be great. He gets a scholarship to Baylor, gets drafted by the Bears. He's an All-American in college. The night they win the Super Bowl, 1985, 86, against the New England Patriots, they demolished him. He says, I come home and I don't know what, he says, as confetti is falling from the ceiling, I don't know why I feel a hole in my heart. But I realize that as I get to the locker room, that it's because I have not seen my father, have not spoken to him since he left some 15 or 20 years before. And he says, and I realize I have to reconcile with him. His wife tells him that he should call him. So, and she's pregnant with her first child. He gets home and he calls. And they yell at each other for the next 2 hours, he said. He said at the end of the 2 hours, he says his father says to him, Mike picks up the phone and says, Dad, it's Mike. And I just want you to know that I forgive you. And the father says, forgive me for what? I've done everything for you. I put food on the table, put clothes on your back, and I put a roof over your head. That's all I owe you. You have nothing to forgive me for. They scream at each other for 2 hours. Long story short, it begins a dialogue for them that would last the rest of his father's life. And they begin the healing process. Now, here's what I'll get to. And I apologize, this story has taken so long. Mike says, as a nation, we need to do what I've done. We need to forgive each other. But there's some things in our history that we have not yet reconciled. And I think that's what I heard from Sidney.
Yep.
There's some things in our history that needs to be reconciled. The way that my father and I had difficult conversations, we need to reconcile some things in our history so that we can move forward. Otherwise, he says, I'll continue to see, white cops killing a black brother in the streets, and this cycle will continue until we have come to that point. So, Sidney, I see you nodding your head, and I don't know why I thought of that experience, and I don't know if I spent too much time recounting it for you, but I felt that's exactly what came to my mind as you sort of delved into that. So, Dave, you go ahead and sit.
Yeah, we're going to be asked for a call to action by. I got to tell you, that may be the call to action that comes out of this forum and out of a discussion. Look, I think we spend too much time as a nation talking about our differences and not enough time talking about our common experience. I also think that, if I've learned one thing in this work is that it's as I said before, it's not economic poverty, it's the human side of poverty. And what are those gaps? What are those differences? And where can we come together and reconcile that? Because I'll tell you, if we don't, I think what we've seen over the summer and even this week in Philadelphia is just a very small wake-up call. If I had a good friend of me that explained kind of what was going on hereby, and he said, look, if I took you and told you I was taking your family from you, I was taking your money and your livelihood from you, and you're back to the wall and you had no other choice, what would you do? I said, well, I would do whatever it takes to react. And he said, why do you think people in the city are any different? Think about what society has done. And I think that's where an awful lot of our focus has got to be is, guys, we need to lift all boats. And we need to take actions, lift all boats, and we got to set aside some of these stupid differences. But a wonderful story by, and it really irritates the point. Reconciliation is where it's got to start, but it's also got to start to say that it's not a we, they, it's an us problem.
Sidney?
I don't really have much to add to that other than at the top of my notes as I was thinking about today, you haven't seen this, but I wrote the words truth, grace, and reconciliation. And I think that those three words are things that I certainly hold as a part of my own call in my work, is to speak truth, even when it creates discomfort. Offer grace to make sure that anyone who's willing can join along collectively in this path toward justice, racial equity, living out those the words of freedom and for all. And then the final piece, is to really reconcile, right? But you can't get to. I think the challenge is, and I'm speaking to in philanthropy specifically, is this need, this urge to want to get to solution and reconciliation. So how do we just get past this? Like, how do we just like, no, well, wait a minute. Well, there's two steps that's prior to that, right? First, we have to make sure we're on the same page about the truth of what has happened, how we got here in the first place. And the policies, the practices, the ideas and biases about Black and brown people that has gotten us here. Offer grace for those who ready and willing to commit themselves individually to joining in this process of creating a new world, imagining and creating a new world. And then reconciliation. And that's what matters, right? That's everything that I do is like centered around those three things.
Joe?
Yeah, well, I'm not quite as eloquent as Sidney, but at the top of my paper, my notes to myself were, I think as a white person of privilege, I have to acknowledge my role and acknowledge history. And I think that my role in history and my role currently, I think I have to, work harder today to validate that racism exists in everything I do, which is something 2 years ago I was not as conscious of. So I'm building that consciousness, and I think that I have to, myself and the organization I lead, we have to be more intentional in our action. And maybe that's moving towards reconciliation, is a way in my mind of moving towards reconciliation. But I think I have to be intentional. And I think that intention to me leads to action. And I think over the, again, I feel like we started on this journey over a year ago, but I think it's been intensified. And I like Sidney's truth, grace, and reconciliation. I think if we all practice that, we'd be in a better place. Maybe some of that'll happen between now and election day.
More importantly, after.
Yeah, I don't know where we are on questions or on call to action, but I think that, just to talk a little bit about how we're trying to be more intentional, and I'd welcome, the community to comment in the chat or with me after, is that, we've tried to be more public facing in how we talk about issues of structural racism as it relates to our work as a foundation in behavioral health. So we've tried to be on the record more about it. I think we're working to change our practices about who we fund. I think if people asked me a year ago, are you funding Black communities? I would have said yes, but I couldn't have said any more than that. So I think it's talking about how to be intentional again about that. And I think the other piece is that, you know, as a foundation, and we're actually delivering a letter to the mayor today around what's been happening this past week, and willing to put our dollars into play to talk about, you know, this notion of like, what would change look like? Well, you know, that change has to be supported and fostered. And I think how can philanthropy, you know, really, you know, not say, well, I fund behavioral health or I fund innovation or, you know, where my silo is, but step outside of that and say, I want to, you know, back to the issue of faith, I want to lift everyone up. So how do I fund practices that lift all people up and build assets? You know, keep coming back to Omar Woodward's, you know, comment, which I think is powerful. So, you know, I think I want to be held to a higher level of intentionality.
Joe, I can't believe it. I just looked at my watch and we're a little past quarter of. And so I want to just start, though, our call to action. I would like to just start briefly with mine, and then, you know, we'll go around the group and maybe the way to do it is we started with Dave, but we'll have Dave end it. After mine, we'll go back to Joe, Sidney, and then David, if you'll wrap up our discussion. Here's my call to action. My call to action is for Vice Sikahema to be all in. Being all in has been really the hallmark of my life, and most of what I've done in my life. My college experience and my NFL career, and then I came to the Eagles and finished my NFL career here, and then I transitioned to television, something that I didn't have any experience in. But in most things I do in my life, it's maybe just something I learned in my home is to be all in, to just go at it as if everything depended on me, and then pray that as if everything depended on God. I want to be all in my service now that I'm retired, about to retire. I've been all in my career, and in my retirement, I want to be all in my service to others. I want to be all in my family. You know, we have 4 children and we've got grandchildren now. I want to always be present when I'm with them. And finally, I want to be all in with my faith. Faith is always important to me. It always has been. It's sustained me. It's given me, I think maybe it was Joe or Sidney who used the word resilience. I think it's given me some measure of resilience in my life, because things have, you know, like everybody else, things don't always aren't always as they appear, and it's been that way in my life. But I think the measure of resilience that I've learned from having faith has been a great blessing to me. I'll wrap up with a verse from John chapter 6, verse 27. I think these are the verses that people reference when they talk about, you know, people say, well, you know, the Bible says if you teach a man to fish, you know, he'll eat forever. It doesn't really say that. The Bible doesn't really say that. I think the reference to it is I think verse 27 of John, where it says, the Savior says, labor not for meat, MEAT, for meat which perisheth, but for that which endureth unto everlasting life. I think that's the reference point of where Jesus says, you know, if you do things, and if you work for things that endure and not for things that perisheth, that's what gives you hope. And that's what's, you know, that's the idea of teaching a man to fish rather than just giving a man fish. I so appreciated. I've written down notes for everything that you guys said. David talked about community, dignity, justice, impact. Those are the 4 pillars of ECS. Sidney talked about truth, grace, and reconciliation. I will have those pillars in my notes, and I'll continue to look at them as I pray every day and every night. Joe talked about the various reforms that we need to have: police reform, healthcare reform. We don't always hear about that. Education reform. We don't always hear about those things. And the last thing that David said that I wrote down is to build trust. Build trust. And I so appreciate it. I've learned something for just being here with you guys. I can't believe that I have, the opportunity to just sit and learn from each of you. And I've jotted down these notes. I will refer to them. I go speak at different places, and I don't want to plagiarize you, but I'm going to reference the things that you've taught me today. And so with that, let me turn the time over to Joe. Joe?
Well, I think I mentioned a little bit of my call to action, but I think that what I would say is that I hope that I'm graceful in the way that I'm all in my intention to build enduring assets within this community. So, kind of building on what everybody has said, I want to feel like things are going to be different, and I'm hopeful they will be.
Joe, thank you. Sidney?
I think systems change when policies change. Policies change when ideas change. Ideas change when people are willing to look within themselves and also change. And so I think my call to action is simply find the closest mirror that you have in the house, stand in it for a long time each day, and ask yourself, like, how must I be radically different to create and imagine and create a new future? Like, what must I radically do differently that I'm doing now?
Well said.
Because it does require us individually and institutionally and collectively to do something very different than we've done for the last however many decades. And that's it.
Well, and
Dave?
yeah, thank you, Vi. And I'm always amazed where you can plan a conversation and then where the spirit takes us. So I'm grateful for that. I am reminded of a phrase that's been attributed to St. Francis. I cannot find the educational reference anywhere, but it was from a good friend of mine when I got into this work. And he said to me, Dave, just remember, preach the gospel, but sometimes use words. And what he meant very specifically was that deeds and actions are a whole lot more powerful than talk. And I think we need to, my takeaway is, and really it echoes both Joe and Sidney and yours, Vi, is the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing. And if nothing else, I'm convinced that innovation, transformation starts with really looking deep and saying, what do we need to do different? Our whole work at ECS is based on coaching. And it goes on a simple assumption. It says that when the brain is in crisis, it can't cognitively work. And if you lower crisis, then people can problem solve, and they can, on their own merits and their own resilience and all the things we've talked about, we can help them move themselves out of poverty. At the same time, we got to get all the rest of us to recognize that there's barriers, both intentional and unintentional, that we've put in place. And we've got to decide that it's in our collective best interest, that our neighbors, love your neighbor as yourself. Your self-interest starts with your neighbor. And I think if we can learn that, the tide rises, and with it, it carries, all of us. So I am very much, I love talk, but I'd rather see the work. And I think, frankly, collaboration and working together, given limited resources, is really the only way to go. But preach the gospel and sometimes use words.
David, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure for me to be on this panel and to moderate it. The easiest job in the world is moderating a group like this, because you just gotta, let the conversation take you, as David said, as the Spirit dictates, and that's exactly what has happened today. By the way, Sidney, as you were talking about looking in the mirror, something occurred to me that my young colleagues at NBC 10 taught me. I kept looking at them, watching them hold their phone up. No, what are you guys doing? They said, we're doing our makeup. Your makeup with your phone? I said, yeah, it's a mirror.
Yeah.
I've seen
You
that.
realize
I've seen people do
I said,
that.
now who?
Apparently, you don't have daughters, Vi.
I've got a daughter, but it just the kind. My mind doesn't go to using my phone as a mirror to
As a
kind
mirror.
of check.
Well,
It's a mirror. The phone's a mirror. Who
yeah.
knew?
Well, Vi, let me take us out here.
Please do. I just want to be sure that I want to say before we go, just to Joe and Sidney, how much I appreciate them. Thank you, Dave. Go ahead.
No, well, I am grateful for all of you, Vi, Sidney, and Joe, and really for all our forum participants for joining us for the Forum on Justice and Opportunity. This was our seventh, and it was founded to bring thought leadership into the system, and I don't think this year has disappointed. I'd like also to thank the staff who have made this possible in the background, our sponsors, our stakeholders, and especially the team behind the forum that has made this week possible. Shelley and April and Abigail and a whole bunch of other people who have just been working on this for literally over a year to make this happen. So well done, and I am grateful. So I'll end where I began, guys. While poverty is not new, what is happening this week in Philadelphia shines a bright light on the brutal facts that confront many in our country. Please join me as we make the conscious and difficult decision to face facts, and we make an absolute accountable decision to make a difference. Let us all engage in the accountable moment and become part of the accountable movement to challenge poverty. My question to you is, what are each of us doing to meet that challenge? Much like what we talked about in the session today. Please share your thoughts and actions in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us, any of us, in the days to follow, and know that we are together in this work. We believe at ECS that the call to service is rooted in our tradition and in our history, and as I mentioned, in our baptismal covenant, which all traditions have a version of. We also know that to challenge poverty, we must all do more than talk, more than convene, we must act. And I call on you with all my heart and all my soul to act now. We are stronger together. I believe that, I've seen it, I know it to be true. And we are stronger when we work with specific and proven actions, some of which I know I learned this week. And I call on you to remember that impact, results, data are powerful tools to implement faith in action. And that is at the heart of what our work has to be. So one last comment and one last action that I would ask you to take and commit to if you haven't already, and that is to please, please vote. We've all talked about how important the election is. It's important that we recognize that voting is a privilege that is unique in many ways to us here in America. Please don't leave that vote on the table. Make your opinion, make your heart felt. So I thank you for your interest. I thank you for the next steps that you will take. And again, we are stronger together. Let's stay in touch to keep that true. Welcome to the Accountable Movement. God bless and have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.